Welcome, and thank you for joining Project Management in an Agile virtual world presented by Digineer. My name is Jack Thiesing, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jeff Barsness is the Project Management Enterprise Consultant at Digineer, both PMP and ACP certified. He has led large migrations and business transformation programs in the healthcare, manufacturing, and digital marketing industries. Kimberly Berger is a senior project management consultant, both PMP and ACP certified, and an advanced certified Scrum Master. She is also currently chair of Professional Development Days 2020 for the PMI Minnesota chapter. Kimberly has industry experience in finance, manufacturing, healthcare, and retail. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature of this webinar. Also, both Jeff and Kimberly are going to broadcast with their webcams. Zoom has some options to toggle to see how the presenters are going to be viewed through the presentation. So please feel free to play around with that. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Jeff and Kimberly.
Hey, thanks, Jack. Jeff and I are excited to be talking to you today about these topics we've seen organizations struggling with, especially as we've all started working remote. And if you notice, the Zoom does have settings. I have a green screen in the background, so you see my Zoom San Francisco just around my green screen in the background. So that's one of the Zoom settings that are fun to play around with.
Yes, and welcome everyone. We're happy to be here today to talk about some of the challenges that we've seen and some of the stories, both from ourselves as well as some of our colleagues on what the sudden shift that many businesses had to make to a remote environment. We'll also be engaging you throughout this discussion to add some of your comments. We have a few polls, and we have an opportunity where you'll be able to provide some of your feedback as well, so we can share that with the rest of the group and so we can learn from each other as well. So to start off, we will have our initial poll, which is, since the stay-at-home orders, what changes have you noticed in the velocity of work, and whether that's increased, decreased, or stayed the same? So we'll give you a couple minutes to answer that. And we'll be going over a couple factors that can drive both a increase or a decrease. Okay, so it's interesting. So then if we show the results here, it looks like the majority of people indicated it stayed the same, but there has been a slight decrease. So this is very interesting. We did this webinar a few weeks ago as well, and there was an increase that was noticed by most people. So it's interesting, depending on the audience and depending on the company, on whether people are noticing an increase or decrease there. One of the areas that we noticed is there was a study that was done by Stanford of about 16,000 participants for the telecommuting group. That was half the company, and then the other half that was working in the office like normal. And they noticed a 13% increase in performance while working remotely. This was a 2-year study from a larger travel agency, and they thought that the positive and negatives would about counteract and offset each other, but they did notice a net positive overall. One of the main benefits, or one of the really notable ones, is that the attrition actually decreased by about 50% for those that were staying at home. And on the other side of the coin, about half of the people that had opted for the stay-at-home option decided to cancel out of that program and go back to the office because of too much isolation. So that's definitely a real thing for a subset of people as well. So the ultimate, go ahead.
No, isolation is one of those things that we still need to tackle, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later in our presentation, how to tackle that.
Absolutely. And so one of the final recommendations out of the study as well was that you should enable the work at home, but have it at least for a few days a week, but not necessarily all the time, to be able to have that good combination of having real connection with people, but still have some of the productivity gains. One of the things that we did want to ask you as well is, as we're going through and as we go through the next items here that Kimberly will go over, if you have any examples or what you think the reasons are for why you saw an increase or a decrease at your particular company, we can then share that here at the end as well. So in the question box on Zoom, if you just enter what your information would be there, that would be great.
Yeah. So just a few more stats, right? So Gallup did a poll, and as you can see from the time of mid-March here of this year to the time of just the first week of April, we went from a 31% of Americans working remote to 62%. So almost our entire workforce, right, working remote. So that was very interesting statistic. And then when they went and asked them, you know, of those 62%, how many of you would want to consider doing this, you know, remote thing more, you know, if you could, if your employer allowed it, even when we get back into the office, you know, 60% of adults said, yeah, I want to keep working remote, versus 41 would rather get back into the office. I'm sure some of them are very much people and would love to see faces and interact more on that level. But it was interesting that the majority of us would rather work remotely and continue to do so. And so if you need to convince your employer that working remote is good for them also, we have I found this neat tool out by the Global Workplace Analytics. So you can plug in on this left side here in the gray area, and when you go to this tool, which I've linked over here, and we can put it in the chat if you guys want. You know, put in what you'd like. These are all, you know, you can put some of these to 0 if you want, right? If you're not going to get any productivity, or you know they're not going to get rid of office space just because you're going to work remote. But then on the right side here, it shows your employer how much they're going to save, right? It shows then how much you're going to save by not going into the office, and then what good it does for the environment, right? Because you're not driving in, using a car, things like that. So, and it mainly focuses around the traffic piece of it. So I guess if you're biking to work anyways, you probably don't get much savings, and probably rather continue to bike to work and get that exercise in. But I thought this is a great tool. It's out there. You do have to register to use it, but it's free. They also have other ones that you can pay for out there, but yeah, I thought it was a great tool if you needed to convince your employer that it's worth it for you and them to continue to work remote.
Yeah, this is, you know, each business is different, and you might have different types of working relationships that you need, and there might be more people that are local, so there could be more or less benefits. And this isn't necessarily a tool that absolutely has to be used as it is. You can put in whatever information you want, and it's really more of a tool for a discussion, especially if there are differing opinions within the company, which I know is a common theme and historically has been, about how much should we have people come into the office versus how much should we allow remote work. And there's differing opinions, and different employees have different opinions as well. So just one additional tool to be able to have that discussion. One other study that was done was NordVPN, which runs a VPN, did an assessment of their network traffic, and they found that the working day increased by about 3 hours on average since mid-March. And that's something that could have been influenced by the fact that people weren't driving in as much, and because in general, it's harder for people sometimes to disconnect from work and have an actual start and end date when you don't, and start and end of your day when you don't really have that commute, or you don't have to be home by a certain specific time. So that is something that you could take into note of what could have been one of the factors for that initial study as well on the people that work remotely on having a longer work day there.
Right. I mean, it's so not having that start and that end date, we call them kind of anchors, right, in your life here. So normally you would have gotten up, grabbed some coffee or got coffee on the way, drove in, had your little routine, right, in the morning. And then at the end of the day, you also had another routine, right? Say goodbye to people, chat a little bit, go home, right? Drive home, decompress, whatever. So working from home has raised those challenges of when's my start and end time. I know when I'm supposed to be working, right? But it seems like you can just continue on and kind of forget about the time. There's no other external cues for you at this point. For instance, a lawyer working in the office, suddenly having to work remote, could not get anything done during the day. He just sat there and struggled trying to accomplish anything. And finally, he just went back to his old routine without going into the office, right? He went in, put his suit on, sat down at the computer, and just got a lot done. And at the end of the day, he went home. And say he went home because he would actually text his wife and say, I'm on my way home, even though all he did was go to the next bedroom and take off his suit and get into his clothes, after work clothes, right? So it was just so key for him, though, in order to get work done, to feel like he went to work, right? So getting dressed for the occasion even was something for him to be able to then actually accomplish what he needed to do. So it was, so those anchors can really help you, but you might not think so, that you'll actually sit and get your work done in the time frame that you used to, rather than just letting the day drag on, or just kind of, as soon as you hit your email in the morning, you just kind of start in on work, right? So being able to control that a bit, just by putting in maybe what might need to be, new routines.
Mhm. Another interesting trend kind of related to the increase or decrease in productivity, one of our colleagues that's a manager, they noticed that people were less willing to take on assignments that were new to them as well. And it seemed that if the support system wasn't readily available for them, for the people to come and ask the people that they were learning from questions more informally, or they didn't feel like it was easy just to pop into the next cube over and get that extra support, that people were a little more tentative and not as willing to take on new tasks that they weren't totally sure about. So that's something that in this particular case, the manager thought that people felt like they were less productive, and he felt they were less productive, but he himself felt more productive because he was more familiar with the work at home environment and knew what he had to do. So part of it comes down to as well how comfortable people are in that environment. And one of the lessons out of this could be just to ensure that you're extra diligent if you are having somebody do something new, and especially if they're not really used to this remote environment, and typically in the past they would have worked side by side with somebody. Make sure that those support systems are in place, and that any other people that would need to be a resource to help them, they're kind of brought along, and that you've pre-arranged that so that the person that you're asking to do this new type of work feels comfortable with that.
Yeah, and Jeff, I just recently started at a new place, right? So I've been onboarding remotely, and I've had to just reach out to people, right, and set up, I call them just stakeholder interviews, reach out to them and talk with them and get to know them. So I've got a list from my manager, and just started, calling people, setting up meetings, and getting to know people remotely, and then even asking those people, who else I should talk to, and things like that. So it's just so important that whoever when you do get an employee, that you're able to give them a list of people they could reach out to, and let them feel comfortable knowing that that's okay to do so.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And if anybody else has any ideas or comments on things that they've seen as what they think there might be an increase or a decrease depending on your company in that productivity, can put that in the question box there as well, and we'll go through those. And then we'll move on to the next poll as well. And Jack, at any time, if there's anything that seems like it'd be a good thing to share, you can bring those up as well.
Definitely. Thank you. I will launch the poll.
So the next poll is, what do you miss most about the hallway conversations? So being in the office with people, and the options are, could miss the context about what's going on in the work environment, missing connecting with people on a personal level, or if you are still basically doing things exactly like you did before and you did a lot of remote type of work, then nothing may have changed for you as well.
I'm going to give you guys about 5 more seconds to complete the poll and I will close it down. Thank you for those that are responding.
And then as a follow-up here as well, if you put into the question box as well how you have received some of that context, anything that you've done that you think would be a good idea for how to really keep those connections with people and keep some of that work side conversation going even with this remote environment. So the results here, connecting with people on a personal level, is definitely the majority of what people are missing. So that sounds pretty consistent to what we've seen before as well. One of the things that we can do just for those connections with people, there are several different types of tools that are available. One of the things is there's actually a virtual cafeteria type room. It's called Sakoko. I've piloted it and we've tested it. I haven't used it extensively in an office setting, but we definitely have talked to other people who have used this and thought it was a pretty interesting tool. Essentially, it allows you to have different rooms, breakout sessions, and a visual representation of what it would be like in a physical environment when everybody is remote. So if you have breakout sessions, so there's certain teams, if you're in an Agile environment and you have a team that always meets together and wants to work together, they could have one of the dedicated rooms. And then when you're logged in throughout the day, you can move between different rooms. And if you're on your lunchtime, you can go to the lunchroom, and then people who are all there, you can just have your Zoom meeting open and other people can join. And you can kind of see where people are. And let's say there's a certain couple-hour period during the day where generally you'll go, and that's the time when you'd go stop by other people's desk sometime during that time frame and just chat and catch up on sports or whatever other items you might want to just touch base with that person on. You could set up a little area where if there's that certain type of topic that a group of people generally talk about, you could indicate during that time frame that you're in that area and you're open and willing to have people just kind of knock on the door and chat with you, take a little break and take a little mental break. So just one of the ideas. There's also a couple other applications. There's one that I found that is a Teams, Microsoft Teams, if you use that application, one that you can set up. It's called the Icebreaker bot, that essentially allows you to add yourself to a specific Microsoft team, and then it'll automatically, periodically set up connections between a couple people, and it has access to your calendar, so it can recommend timeframes as well to help foster some of that networking that may be missing and harder to do when you don't see people in person.
Yeah.
Jeff and Kimberly, we have some comments too on the Q&A. People are definitely listening. So one of the users says that sometimes he reaches out on Skype if they are available to have a conversation and tries to convince them to connect using both audio and maybe video. And another user also says using the video feature to connect with colleagues and stakeholders has helped her picking up on the nonverbals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those nonverbals, we have a slide further in too that talks about that nonverbal cues and how important they are. So Jeff, yeah, I did Sakoko with Jeff. I thought this was a great tool. It also has Zoom and things already integrated with it, so you can just end up in a room and press Zoom and you can all be on video and see each other that way too. So it has some great features in it. And then something that maybe isn't as fun but kind of needed is when you need to collaborate, right, as a team and visually see things. So I've used Mural a few times now as a tool. So it's like, I call it sticky notes virtually. So, you know, when you're doing product backlog grooming or PI planning, or you just need to, you know, I guess, map out a business process, right? So that you can see it, and you're no longer able to get in a room and do that. You can easily do it, and it's a pretty easy tool to work with. I've enjoyed working with that one also for collaboration.
Yeah, that's great. Another, getting more on a little bit of kind of the personal connection side of things. One of the things we did at our company was had a virtual bingo night where you invited, it was kind of after hours, and everybody was invited, including your friends and family, and generally your family, because everybody's just stuck in their houses. But it was a good combination of being able to see everybody, have some of that game personality, fun type of interaction. And then because there was a lot of people, there were probably 40 or 50 people, and when you have your family there as well, I had my daughters there sitting on the couch, and so we could just go on mute and have some of that interaction just in our personal environment, as well as kind of having the larger group interaction. So that was a pretty fun activity. And then virtual happy hours, I'm sure a lot of you have probably already done that as well, since you can't really go out right now to meet up with people. Just opening up a Zoom session and, you know, getting a drink and chatting just like you would, having it not be a specific topic or meeting that you're talking about, but being able to maintain some of that that connection. So that would be another thing that if anybody has any other tools like that that they've used or that they think would be really valuable, you can put those in the question box as well, and we'll go through and comment on those.
Yeah, and share, because I think lots of people are wondering how else they can connect, right, or have fun even. I think virtual happy hours have overtaken our evenings on one level, at least they have mine. So whether it's with friends, family, or work, or your volunteer organizations, they seem to be proliferating everywhere. So as we talk about Zoom fatigue, right? So what are some other ways we can connect without maybe Zoom? And then, you know, as we talked about earlier up front in our slide presentation here, there was that isolation, you know, where half the people opted to not work from home due to the isolation. And how can we mitigate this? You know, maybe you want to elaborate a little bit more on that, on how we can mitigate this isolation that we all feel. One of this, you know, we've talked about connecting virtually and everything, but there's other ways, you know, as far as just even getting outside for even a few minutes, that can help you not feel as isolated. Believe it or not, that sunshine helps. Granted, on a cloudy days like it is today here in Minnesota, not so much.
Yep, absolutely. And, you know, another thing that I've found too is sometimes there'll be people that you just see in the hallway when you are physically in the same location, but you don't necessarily have meetings with them. And so if it's been a couple months now that since you've talked to some of those people, it could be a good opportunity just to think about, you know, set up some time just to connect with the people and maintain some of those connections that you had before that may have dropped off just because there's not a typical meeting that they would be at the same time. And if the isolation issue here, just something to keep in mind too, is as we noted from that initial study too, of a lot of people that even opted out of doing the work at home because of the isolation. That is definitely something that is real and something to keep note of. So as Kimberly mentioned before, there is a big percentage of the communication, 80% of communication is based on visual cues. And so this is definitely something that having that video whether it's the Zoom, and somebody on the comments noted this as well. And we've found that it's kind of a working agreement that you kind of want to put in place to related to the video. So if there are certain times, and maybe it's not every single meeting, maybe people don't want to be on video all the time, but having certain times and certain scenarios where you do have the video on, and especially if you make that expectation up front so people aren't taken by surprise of, hey, now turn on your video. It's kind of planned of at least this certain status meeting with the whole team. We're going to do that just to be able to connect with people. And this also kind of ties in with the working agreement about having some of that just dialogue, personal dialogue on the meetings. And it's a little bit of a gray area. People aren't sure sometimes, should we just get right into it and get to business, or is it okay to have a little discussion for the first few minutes of a meeting? So whatever your decision is, or however you want to have that be set up in your company, just having that so it's kind of a norm and it's okay. So on these certain meetings, we're going to spend the first 5 minutes just talking to see how everybody is, checking in, because we don't really have an opportunity to do that in person. And then that would help the people who would really want that to say, it's okay, we can have that discussion. And then the people who may want to just get down to business, set the expectation that, okay, at least on these meetings, we're going to do that. That's part of the reason for this meeting, is to have some of that connection as well. So something that you can just do consciously to help make a good mixture and a good approach there.
And I think video best practices is coming out and coming soon, right? And a few that we've heard are one-on-ones, video on, right? If you're doing a one-on-one, video on is preferred. If it's a really large meeting, lots of people, probably preferred not to, because you're not going to see them all anyways, right? So it's just it's coming, right? As we do more and more of the video meetings and stuff, what's going to be best practice and what's not. But those are a few things we've heard so far that, and most people on a one-on-one really do just want to, they're chatting with each other and should be pretty comfortable with each other on that.
Yeah. And our next poll here is, we're going to get your sense of whether you prefer having video on for work meetings, and either whether you like to have it on all the time, sometimes, or you just don't want it on at all. I'll give everybody a couple minutes here.
Thank you again for those that are responding. I'll give it another 20 seconds or so.
So this is something that's interesting to keep in mind as well, is there are different people that have different personality types that prefer the video more or less. So if you're an introverted person and you really just don't like the video on, that's, especially if you're in a culture where that's not something that's always been happening and it's not normal, then it may be a little bit uncomfortable to have the video on at first. And as people are working at home now, it may become more and more of a norm, but just being conscious of that if you are setting up the meetings. And we'll take a look at the poll results here. So this kind of aligns with what we were just talking about, where the vast majority of people here like to have the video on sometimes. So you like having some of that connection, but not necessarily having to have it on all the time. Kimberly kind of noted this before too, about the Zoom fatigue, and that is definitely a real thing. That part of it is because you have to work so hard. In person, you notice some of the facial expressions and you notice some of the things just naturally, and you don't have to work at it. But when you're on a Zoom call, you can see some of those facial expressions and you can see things, but it's a much smaller picture. You have multiple people there at the same time, and it's kind of using a different part of your brain, and it takes work. And so you get some of those benefits, but you have to work for those benefits, and it just can get tiring. So that's where that combination of not necessarily having it on all the time, but having at least specific times when you can get those benefits, that could really help.
And sometimes you just don't want it on because you didn't take the shower that day, right?
Well, And Kimberly, we've got an attendee who also commented that said that maybe they'd like to have their camera on if their hair could be done.
Yes.
I know, right? And not, these stay-at-home orders, we haven't been able to go to the salon or anything or get our hair cut. And I think I've seen a lot more people say, can we not have video on recently, just because they're like, I can't find the hat. I can't get my hair cut, whatever, right? So it's become more of a, I haven't been able to get out of the house to get anything done to make myself look okay on video.
Yep. And that ties back exactly to what we were talking about too, of setting the expectation ahead of time. So, the day before your meeting, or if there's going to be a certain meeting, if people know going in, then they won't feel as rushed, and they won't feel just taken off guard of, oh no, I'm not ready. I don't want to be on video right now. I would have done something different if I knew that.
Yep. I would have put my makeup on that day,
Yep, exactly. So the other thing, if it is something where you want to foster that culture of having some video on, and it's not a norm in your company, something that would be good to do as well is start with the one-on-one meetings. So especially if people haven't really used their camera before, they aren't sure if it's how it really looks, and just getting that one-on-one first, try it out, see if they have any questions or concerns about it, and just kind of getting comfortable with it, because as you do something more, no matter what it is, you start getting more and more comfortable. So that could help. Another couple things related to the video as well, is especially if there's a lot of people in the meeting, and if you're a quieter person and you provide your feedback just kind of with nodding or with facial expressions, sometimes it's harder to see that. So making a conscious effort to actually acknowledge verbally something that you normally might be able to just nod, to make sure that people are aware that yes, you've heard them, and that you aren't ignoring them.
Yeah. Practicing with your camera and your voice and the lighting. There's a lot that goes into this, putting the camera on. I think a lot more than what I think many of us thought. I've seen some people pretty much get a whole studio now together, right? So they can be on camera with the lighting and the backlighting and reflection and making sure their room's set up a certain way. So I have to admit, it seems like there's a lot that goes into being on this camera, right? But again, practice so you get comfortable with it and get comfortable with the way you look and sound on it, helps a lot. So.
And the one thing I've noticed too is, especially depending on what group of people it is, as you start meeting with a certain group of people over video, then when you don't have a call that's on video with them, you feel like you're missing something. So you don't, almost start building that rapport with that group of people that you expect to see them and expect to have those facial expressions. And then it almost seems like you can revert back to more of the talking over each other, because you can't see when the other person's about to start talking. And it's more of like a real conversation when you can actually see the other person. So it's just an interesting thing that I mentioned and noticed over time as well.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll next go to our next poll, which is, what were you most unprepared for regarding having employees work remotely? And some of the options will be technology or hardware and software, standards around methods of communication, how to address employee concerns remotely, other household members joining the meetings, or having to focus more reactively to address the current and urgent challenges versus strategic outcomes. And Jack, I'm not seeing the poll up.
I think that we're having a little bit of difficulty here. So yeah, maybe if people could make comments about it.
Okay, so I'll just read those again. What you were most unprepared for regarding having employees work remotely, and if something just stands out, so whether it's technology, hardware, software issues, if it's how you communicate with people, because normally you're used to having the discussion in person, and now there's something that's missing related to that. If there is a different way that you have to address employee concerns that was something that you weren't prepared for. Having to focus more reactively to address the current and urgent challenges, and with everything, especially if your company is related to a type of service that would be impacted by COVID and how your customers relate with them if you had to work differently. So if you could put those into the question, kind of what your comments are, what your thoughts were, and then we'll go through those as well. And in the meantime, I'll talk about a couple of them. One is related for addressing employee concerns remotely. Sometimes if somebody is not comfortable saying things over email or chat and they just like to stop by, then that's where there could be that uncomfortable, learning how to communicate a new way. And so if you're having the one-on-one discussion with somebody, specifically asking how are people doing, do they have any concerns, and digging a little bit deeper to see just, is there anything in the environment that could help them work better, and kind of really digging in more. So if they aren't communicating verbally or through text with what an issue is, just digging a little deeper to see if there is anything else going on there.
A couple of comments, Jeff.
Okay, go ahead.
One attendee says that personal interaction with their clients, for sure. It's better for them to have the customer show them the issues. And another attendee is saying that being more reactive and less strategic.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And we've heard that being more reactive in the last session that we did of this, that was the number one response as well. We have a couple examples related to that. One is one of our consultants at a client that is very heavily focused on healthcare and direct interaction with customers who would be impacted by the coronavirus. And so there were a lot of changes that had to happen, and a whole bunch of people had totally shift their day-to-day work of what they were doing to instead shift to be able to put in these solutions to be able to address that interaction with the customers. So the way that she was able to kind of think more strategically related to that as well is when all the different silos within the organization were really just focused on what we need to do right now. She was kind of thinking about how they all fit together, and in a few months from now, especially when there's things that are maybe just a temporary solution that they'll shut off after things settle down, how can we make sure that we know all the stuff that we're doing and be able to have a plan so how we can back them out later on. So it ended up being a great way to, one, track all the work that's been done to be able to plan for the future. But there was a great side benefit as well of being able to really demonstrate this is all the great work that we've done as a team. And even though people might be feeling, I'm not getting any of my work done that I'm supposed to be doing because they had to shift to do a different type of work, it can still show both to the employees and people, make them realize that look at all of the great, really important work that we've been doing and what we accomplished. And their leadership can also see that as well and really understand how much of an impact it's having. So that's one good example.
Yeah.
We have a attendee commenting too that norms around company meetings have changed a little bit, and that also for them, they might have to do a fair amount of follow-up because many folks are scheduled for multiple meetings in a given time slot.
Mm-hmm.
Into that.
Yeah, and so I think that it sounds like because people are scheduled for the same time slot, so because more of the meetings all have to happen online and people are booked up, your whole schedule is just solidly booked with all of these remote meetings, it's harder to find time that's open for everybody, where before half of those meetings might have just been more ad hoc or more in person or talking to people, where now you have to specifically set aside time on your calendar to be able to just talk to somebody. And even though you might have just had you might have had several little 5-minute conversations throughout the day. You don't really set up a 5-minute meeting. You said, here's the half-hour block here, half-hour block here, half-hour block here. So that can add up and make it so people feel like their schedule is more blocked out than it even was before.
Right,
Yeah.
and I think not having to find a room anymore for everybody to get into, right? Or if you were double booked, you would have just walked over to the other person and said, is it okay if I book you at the same time, or should I move it? You're not having, again, those hallway 5-minute conversations to even figure that out anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Even for myself, I find that if I happen to be on a meeting with somebody or a group of people, there might be somebody that I point out and just say, hey, can you hold on for 30 more seconds before we disconnect? That's how I find my hallway conversation.
Yeah.
Yep. So speaking of the norms in the meetings too, and this is actually one that Jack had noticed himself, is if you are on the calls and you're doing other things like removing the dishes from the dishwasher, it's pretty obvious that you aren't totally focused and what's going on. So just be aware of that as well. That I think, Jack, you had commented on, I got all the dishes done before this meeting, but be aware that people can hear what's going on in the background, and you can tell when people aren't focused. And even as easy as it is to get sidetracked to do other things because you're just in your house and able to do other things, it is something that does come through even if you aren't verbally, or even if there's not necessarily audio associated with that.
But I do think it's been a little bit more acceptable to be interrupted by your child or your pet these days, or your significant other. I think people are realizing, we're all living in our houses and everybody's in one space now. They can't really get away. So the interruptions have become almost acceptable on one level, unless you're in a really stressful meeting, I guess is what I want to say. But I think that everybody's been a little bit more, okay with that, right?
Yep, absolutely. One other example for the being strategic and kind of thinking ahead, one of the other polls, PricewaterhouseCoopers did a survey as well, and 54% of healthcare companies indicated that they're going to accelerate the automation and new ways of working when people start coming back into the office. So a lot of companies have noticed they had to change processes, change business processes and things that they do that normally would be, a piece of paper that somebody hands to somebody, or you're able to just talk and hand over something as far as process steps. You can't really do that the same way. It's more difficult, and it's becoming even more important to find opportunities to automate things and to kind of be proactive in how you set things up to be able to allow for something to be more smooth. One example is one of our consultants here also set up, they had a scenario where there were a lot of company meetings or team meetings that were taking a really long time because there were lots of different people that were distributed, and the majority of the meeting was taken up just for getting everybody up to speed on what had happened since the last time they met. And so it was a very inefficient use of time, and a lot of things were just delayed until that meeting, and then it would be handed over to the next team. So things were taking longer as well, where they implemented an automation tool. In that case, it was Monday.com, but there are other tools as well that can be used where everybody put in their status and their updates. And before those team meetings, everybody's responsibility was to go in and be aware of where things were with the other teams. So then it could really be focused more on forward-thinking decisions and next steps and discussing how to collaborate versus what happened over the past week and what have people done and where things were. With a tool like that, you can also add in some of that automation, so there's less things that would fall through the cracks, because as soon as it goes to one status, then it would automatically notify the next person in that work stream that now it's up to you and you can do your step. And you can really streamline things a lot with that type of software. And there's a lot of different software options that can do that as well, and process updates could be done. So I think those are the main areas of discussion that we wanted to cover today. If anybody else has any last questions or comments, you can feel free to put those in the questions now, and we can go over those. And if not, then we'll close out the meeting.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining today. It was a very interesting comments that we heard from everybody. It was great to be able to talk through some of the changes that we've seen, both ourselves and some of our clients have seen. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to us as well, and we'd be happy to have further discussion with everybody.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.